Hi guys, just a short announcement before I start this tutorial. I have launched a new food illustration class on Skillshare. This time I decided to make these colorful gummy bears, and I'll be sharing the process right from the beginning, from looking at references to figuring out the shapes of the bears that I want to create, to drawing, shading, and then painting it step by step. Because of the very simple composition, there will be a lot of repeated steps where you can learn and improve along the way as you paint. So I think that this is suited for all levels. Maybe not for someone who's never used watercolors before, but I think it'll still be doable for beginners as well. And if this sounds like something any of you are interested in and you've never been a member on Skillshare yet, you can go to the link in my description box for a free month of membership trial where you can have access to all the classes on Skillshare, including this one. There's quite a few of you who asked me to post more food illustrations, and Skillshare is where you can find most of my food illustration classes because I tend to have a more detailed approach when it comes to painting food, and with Skillshare I'm able to make the classes much more in depth since I'm able to break them down into shorter lessons, so you won't miss any of the steps. And yeah, if any of you guys are interested, come join me on Skillshare as well. Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be making these vintage looking doodles. I wanted to play with muted colors, so I'm just going to go right in. Here are the colors that I'll be using. Indigo by Schmincke, Viridian Hue by Holbein, Moonglow by Daniel Smith, Gold Brown by Schmincke, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, and Indian Red by Schmincke. I'll also be using my Sakura Micron pen, 0.1 in Sepia, and my white jelly roll pen. This is optional, but I'm going to add a little bit of gold shimmers for my painting, and for that I'm going to use my Finetech Gold palette. I'm going to divide the space into 4, and since I'm pretty bad with spacing, I'm just going to measure it out and dot the middle of each side so I know where to stop the paint. You can also turn this into cards or individual doodles if you would like. The first thing I'm going to do is to create 4 rectangles with the base colors. I'm starting with gold brown, which I'm going to spread loosely while leaving a bit of dry brush textures and white negative spaces. Then I'm going to follow this up with buff titanium, and I'm going to use buff titanium for all 4 rectangles in order to give a little bit of consistency of the color tonality between all 4. For the edges, I want them to be a little bit messy and loose because I feel like this would add character to the painting. For the next one, I'm going to use Moonglow followed with buff titanium, and I'm going to use the same technique in terms of application to create the textures and the uneven edges. I don't want the buff titanium to mix completely with the colors. Instead, I want the buff titanium to only mingle with the Moonglow or any of the main colors. And if I place too much buff titanium in one spot while the surface is still wet, I can keep dotting the main color. For all these, I'm only going to use a light to medium consistency, and I like to add either more water or paint so I can create those uneven values for the rectangles. And moving on to the next one, the main color is the indigo, and I'm also going to follow this up with buff titanium. As for the last one, I'm going to use Indian Red. These are just the colors that I've chosen due to the muted tonality, but if you want, you can also use brighter colors as well for these types of doodles. Because I painted on quite a large surface, the paper is still wet, so meanwhile I feel like adding different hues to some of the squares. So I'm adding a touch of Viridian to the blue, and I'm going to add a touch of gold brown to the purple. I'm quite happy with these base colors, so I'm just going to dry it off with a hairdryer so it's much quicker to work on. Okay, so now we can start to work on the first one. This is the simplest one. I just used a mix of gold brown with Indian red, and I'm going to create circles. In a light to medium consistency, I'm just spreading them around the area, and I also want to play around with these two colors. So sometimes some circles can be a bit more yellow or some a bit more brown, or a mix of the two colors. I like to also play around with the values, so some circles can be a bit lighter, some can be a little bit darker, but I wouldn't recommend for it to be too dark because we are still going to doodle on top of these with pen. After I finish painting a few circles, I'm just going to use the same color to add little dots underneath all of the circles, and this is just going to connect to the stem later that we're going to draw out. After I'm done, I'm just going to dry it off with a hair dryer so I can doodle on top of these. For this one, I'm just going to create flat flower-like shape on top of these circles. They're kind of like flower petals, but they're facing the top so it looks a bit smushed. Next, I'm going to line the sides and also add vertical contour lines. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it'll give the impression of these flower buds to look a bit more round. Next, I'm going to connect them to stems. It doesn't have to be perfectly straight up and down. I like to make them a little bit crooked, and I feel like it's just going to give a little bit more character that way. I'm also going to add leaves on either side of those stems, and I'm just drawing tiny ones, but you can also do other leaf shapes as well. After doodling these ones, I felt like the space still looks a bit empty, so I'm just adding more circles here, but this time in a lighter consistency, so the ones that I doodled earlier stands out against the ones that I'm adding on now. For the leaves, I just added Viridian to the brown mixture, so the green is muted, and I'm just going to really loosely paint on some of the leaves, and if I feel like I need to add more, I'm just going to paint it on, even if it's not outlined. Here I felt like adding one more, but this time I put less pressure in the lines so it looks lighter and looser, but this is just something that you can freely adjust to your composition. Moving on to the next one, I'm using a mixture of indigo with moon glow, and I'm using a thin to medium consistency and then following it up with a mixture of gold brown and Viridian. The shape that I'm making now is like an upside down strawberry with leaves, or what is actually supposed to be the sepals at the bottom with the green mix. And just like before, I'm going to scatter them around the space while playing with the value of the colors for a bit of variation. I want them to mostly come from a main stem, so the bottom is more or less directed to the bottom center of the rectangle space. As you can see, the shapes doesn't have to be perfect because we're still going to draw on top of it anyway, and I like the fact that the imperfections give a looser effect to the painting. Then once I painted a few, I just dried it off so I can draw on top of the painted areas. For the drawing, I follow the strawberry shape, and I'm going to draw out what looks like tiny hairs followed with the pointy sepal leaves, and at the same time I try to correct the shapes while I'm drawing if the base paint looks a bit too crooked. For the midsection, I just add the hairy or pointy textures randomly. It's important to not align the curved lines the same way, but to somewhat direct them to the top center and follow the curvature or the round contour of those shapes. Before adding the stem, I like to add the continuation of the sepals first to balance out the weight. So I'm just going to draw them on, then continue on with the stem. When I was drawing this, I was thinking about blue thistles, and their leaves are really interesting but a bit complicated. However, I just tried to break it down by drawing the midrib first so I know where the direction of the leaf is, and then on both sides I tried to make tall, wavy or pointy outline, with the top being thinner and the bottom near the stem to be a bit wider overall. But sometimes I also like to play around with the different lengths to keep it looking natural and varied. You can leave it here, but I wanted to fill in the space a bit more. I painted more just like the previous one in a thinner consistency, and I tried to just do dashed lines along the outline as I'm drawing them later instead of drawing the full shape of the texture. So this one is less detailed, so it won't take away from the main ones that I drew out earlier. For the leaves, I used the same green mixture from the Gold Brown and Viridian, and I'm just loosely painting it, not being too worried about following the outline. For a bit of added texture, I'm going to add white dots to the top part, but the first one I didn't really know where I want to place them, so I added to the whole area, and I felt like it was a bit too much, but considering this white pen is water soluble, you can always take off the excess with a clean damp brush. Moving on to the next one, I'm going to use a mix of indigo with Indian red and paint a branch. I want the branches to be wavy, so I made sure to make those wavy lines branching out from the main stem. For this, I want to try a different composition, so I started from the bottom left, going to the top right to make a diagonal composition. On the branches, I just use indigo to paint little blueberries. I'm just painting clusters of circles on some of the branches until I have a few of those clusters scattered across the branches. Again, I'm just using a light to medium consistency for this. This one may look a bit dark, but as it dries, it will fade a little bit, and this goes for any subject that I'm painting here, because if I don't paint it light enough, the pen doodle that I'm going to draw on top of the subject that I'm painting now won't show through. Once I'm done, just like before, I'm going to make sure it's completely dried off with a hairdryer to make it nice and quick. And then I'm just going to outline the circles. This time, as I'm outlining, I also want to play around with the placement of the berries. I like to place one on top of another. If not, it'll just look like polka dots. So I made sure that at least at the center of each cluster, the berries are a bit more dense and closer together in the middle. I want to outline the branches as well to define the fun wavy lines, and I'm also going to add more with my pen if I feel like it would look better in the composition. Whenever I draw the branches near the clusters, I just add extra lines near some of the berries if the bottom is kind of exposed, so the berries connect to the branch. Once I'm done outlining the branch, I'm going to go over some areas with indigo again, this time with a slightly thicker consistency, and I'm going to paint on the berries which are hidden behind to create more depth within the composition. After that, I'm going to add more if I feel like some space needs to be filled in and adjust the balance or the fullness of the composition. For some of the berries, I'm going to add white dots for highlights. I only added a bit here because I wasn't sure yet, but I'll just get back to it once I finish all of the doodles so I get to see what it looks like as a whole. Moving on to the final doodle, I'm going to create Cosmo flowers, and I use a mix of Indian red with gold brown. I've made a tutorial on this before and it's more or less the same but simpler, and it doesn't have to be as accurate. I just want to make a 3 to 4 petaled flower from the side view so the petals are more or less fanning out. And I'm also going to add flower buds if there are empty spaces, which is not big enough to be filled with more flowers. Once I finish painting the flowers, I continue the bottom with the same green mix, and then before I doodle on top of it, I make sure it's completely dry with a hair dryer, and then I'm going to just draw on the petals with the tip of the petals being a bit frilly and from the bottom of the petals to be a bit textured with fine lines. Same goes for the flower buds, which I just made into closed up flower petals with the same texture. Once I'm done, I'm going to connect them to the stem, and as for the stem, I like to make them a bit wavy and fun to give a more interesting composition. I'm going to add on the leaves now. I just want to make very fine leaves by drawing the middle first, and I'm going to make really long fine leaves on either side by connecting the lines and looping each of them instead of drawing them individually, and I feel like this gives more of a loose style with a bit more dynamic. For the color, I use the same mixture of Viridian with gold brown, but this time I only use a tiny bit of Viridian so the color of the leaves look a bit more earthy. I have a few flowers here, but I'm just going to fill in the sides. I'm going to create the same flowers, but this time a bit lighter and with lighter outline as well, so it doesn't take away from the main ones that I drew out earlier. Now that I've basically doodled on all the 4 frames, I'm just going to play around with a little bit of gold to decorate the background. This is completely optional, but I just dot some gold around the blue thistles and around the blueberries. And then with a clean damp brush, I just smudge the gold to give very subtle shimmers to the background, and I find that this also gives a vintage vibe at the same time. I'm only going to do this for the cooler temperature backgrounds because I find that the yellow gold complements the cooler tones, and I think if I were to do them for all the squares it would look a bit too crowded, so I'm just going to leave the rest as is. Here I decided to darken the Cosmo flowers because I find that the background is taking away from the main subject, so I just layered on the same color but still varying the values, so some is a bit darker than others. Finally, I'm going to add white textures for the cosmos with the darker color, and I'm also going to add highlights to the blueberries like what I did earlier. I'm just going to enlarge some of the dots that I already drew out earlier and add more around the berries so they look a bit more plump. As for the first one, I'm going to add highlights to the poppy flower buds. Here I just made them more round and shiny, even though I don't think that's what they look like in real life. I just think it's cute to make them more round. As for the thistles, I just added more white to the top part of the flowers. And that's basically it. This was just one of those fun, carefree doodles. Like I mentioned before, this would also look cute as individual cards or individual doodles. But yeah, like usual, all the list of tools that I use in this video, as well as my social media links, will be in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!